plans for the pound on the day the Adam Smith Institute entered the IndyRef debate, saying sterlingization is best post-independence. We discuss why and what it would mean. And we ask a bank boss in Panama how using the US dollar works for them. The fight over what currency an independent Scotland would use has stepped up in recent weeks, and today the Adam Smith Institute entered the debate. A report for the think tank says following a yes vote, Scotland should use the pound without the UK's permission, arguing banks would be less likely to take risks. Better Together, though, say the proposal would be a disaster for Scotland. Here's STV's political reporter, Carol Erskine.
La ciudad de Panama es el camino.
Panama, the Central American country with plentiful sun, sea and sandy beaches. Perhaps not much in common with Scotland, but if there's a yes vote in September's referendum, some reckon we should look to their currency arrangement to shape our own. Today the Adam Smith Institute said Panama's practice of using the US dollar without a central bank was one an independent Scotland should replicate with the pound.
I think that the informal, well, I'm calling it adaptive sterlingization, is by far the best route for Scotland. And I think that not only is it a good plan B, it should be plan A. It's better than a formal currency union because banks will act more prudently. And we know this by looking at countries like Panama, Ecuador, El Salvador.
Those behind the report say Scotland has a strong banking history that should be drawn upon after the referendum.
Scotland had a hugely successful period in its history in the 18th and 19th centuries where it had essentially the system we're putting forward. If Scottish voters and Scottish politicians after independence looked to this period, they would see that you can have immense wealth, an incredibly stable economy and a very, very healthy financial sector.
The SNP said today's report was interesting but maintained their position that an independent Scotland would have a formal currency union with the rest of the UK. Better Together argue that using the Panama model would be disastrous for the Scottish economy because it would hand control of monetary policy to a foreign country and ultimately push up credit card bills and mortgage repayments.
It's kind of what I would expect from what you might call a right-wing think tank. Because it's essentially undermining the idea of having a central bank at all. And there are quite a lot of right-wing economists who think central banks are a bad idea and that ordinary banks should just stand on their own 2 feet.
But there is a warning this system could see us pay more for borrowing.
In terms of, for example, credit card bills, the idea there is that interest rates would be higher. And there is a possibility that that would happen because the banks wouldn't have a lender of last resort, so they're kind of more risky. And the greater the risk, the higher the interest rates they're going to charge might be.
Once the headquarters of the Union Bank of Scotland in the 19th century, this building was constructed during a period of economic and financial stability in Scotland that today's author says could be replicated with this sterlingization plan post-independence. But what isn't addressed is how big a risk the financial markets would see that option. Both sides in the referendum debate entrenched more than ever on their positions on the pound.
Well, joining me earlier from London was the author of the report, Sam Bowman. Better Together say sterlingization would be a disaster for Scotland, as it would mean a foreign country having control of our monetary policy. Do they have a point?
I don't think so, actually. The advantage of the system we're outlining is that banks would be able to increase and decrease their balance sheets according to the business cycle. So what that means in layman's terms really is when things are looking bad, banks will issue more notes so that we'll have more demand. When things are going well, they will take in more notes and there will be less demand. That gives you an automatic stabilizer and it prevents the kind of demand-side recession that they're going through in Europe at the moment. The second advantage of the system we're proposing is that banks would not be able to receive a bailout from a central lender of last resort. And that means that if they acted badly, if they were reckless, they would have to make their own provisions to repay their debts and so on. Usually, and the system that we're proposing would mean that shareholders were the people who took the hit, not taxpayers. And when we looked at history and we looked at countries that do this kind of system, their banks have been much, much more stable and much, much more prudent than the banks that we're used to in the UK. So I think actually what the system we're proposing would do is avoid a lot of the monetary problems that lead to recessions and thus unemployment, but also give you a much more stable, prudent banking system for many years to come. And I think that would actually, the stability that would provide would be very good for the Scottish economy.
But if there was no lender of last resort, I mean, why would major financial institutions remain in Scotland and take that risk? Because many would see that as a risk.
Well, because there are still customers in Scotland and there are still profit opportunities to be had. Investment takes place when there are real profit opportunities. That means it's separate from the nominal economy and so on. What it would mean, though, is that banks were more careful about who they lent to. And I think that's something that we could all use some more of in most developed countries. The problem we've had in most recent years is not that banks have been too prudent or too risk averse, is that they've been reckless and that they've taken huge risks because they knew that they weren't going to be the ones who would take the hit. The system that we're proposing would put the hit on them, and that we've looked at countries like Panama, we've looked at Scotland's own history where they've had this kind of system. That would give them many more reasons to act prudently.
You know, that's all very well what you're saying in theory, but is there any evidence from around the world that this could work? You mentioned Panama there, but where else?
Well, there are three major countries in Latin America that use the US dollar instead of their own currency, and they're Ecuador, El Salvador and Panama. Now, Ecuador and El Salvador have both been praised by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta in America as having, since they've instituted this kind of system, as having very, in fact, remarkably stable banking systems. And in fact, Ecuador did this to get out of a financial crisis, and since they introduced the dollar, they've had a much more stable economy as a whole. But the one that we're really interested in is Panama, because Panama's quite a well-developed economy. It's got a very well-developed financial sector, and they have very few of the kind of bailout mechanisms that are present in most Western economies. And as a result, astonishingly for a country of Panama's wealth, they have the 7th soundest banks in the world, and they do very well. They're in the top 10 for almost every financial health metric that we have. So what that means really is that the banks there know that they won't get a bailout, so they act responsibly. That's what the evidence shows, and I think the onus is on people who are claiming that there would be huge problems without a lender of last resort to show why this is wrong, and they haven't been able to do that.
Is Scotland's economy suited to sterlingization?
Absolutely. In fact, Scotland's one of the few economies in the world that is ideal for this kind of system because, unlike most countries, Scottish consumers are used to handling lots of different notes. And the real difficulty in a transition to the system we're outlining is that most people, say in England, don't have any idea what it's like to use lots of different banknotes. They don't pay attention to the notes that they use and so on. Scottish consumers are used to that. So the difference would be, though, that Scottish consumers would be able to pick and choose what banks they trusted and what banks they didn't. We know from history, we know from Scottish history, that banks that were acting recklessly and might not be able to honour the value of their notes would be very quickly driven out of the market. The mechanisms that we're proposing flourished in Scotland between the 18th and 19th centuries. The period really was a golden age. What we're proposing is a return to this kind of system where taxpayers and so on are not on the line to bail out banks. Banks have to provide for themselves.
You say that there would be no provision to bail out banks, but would that not be worrying for bank customers? People with mortgages, people with businesses, would they have confidence in this system?
They would, because the people who would ultimately pay the price were shareholders. So in history, when, for example, the Scottish Bank failed during the free banking era, and a few banks did fail, but what happened was depositors got almost all of their deposits back because it was shareholders that took the hit. It was the owners of the bank who ended up having to pay for the losses that they incurred. But what's interesting is depositors didn't get all of their money back. They lost a couple of %, not enough to bankrupt them, but enough to make them careful about where they put their money in the first place. That's something we're missing at the moment, because if you're a customer of a bank, it doesn't matter to you how risky the bank is, because you have deposit insurance provided by the state that will give you your money back no matter what. You take that deposit insurance away, but you provide for the owners of the bank compensating you most of your deposit. You still have a reason to shop around, find the safest bank to put your money in, and that is the mechanism that would make banks act prudently. They would need to attract customers by acting well, and this has worked very successfully in history, and I think it could work again today.
You talk about sterlingisation, but currency in general, how important an issue do you think this is going to be in the referendum debate in Scotland?
Well, it seems to be a huge debate. It seems to be a hugely important issue, and I think with good reason, because the monetary system of an economy is absolutely crucial to the operation of the whole economy. A great example of this is the Eurozone, where money has been very, very tight. They've been obsessed with stopping inflation and at the cost of huge, huge levels of unemployment. If they had easier money in the Eurozone, they would probably be avoiding most of the recession that they're living through now. The system that we're proposing allows banks to be the people who issue more notes, and it means they're the ones who are on the front line issuing more notes when there is more demand, which comes about when people are worried about the future. So you get this built-in automatic stabilizer that prevents demand-side recessions and means that when there is a supply shock, for example an oil crisis, people's purchasing power falls, but they're still able to pay their bills, they're still able to put food on the table, and you don't get this widespread mass unemployment that has become all too familiar in the last couple of years.
Sam Bowman, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
As you heard Sam Bowman mention there, Panama is an example of a country which uses a currency, the US dollar, without a central bank. Earlier I spoke to Ariel San Martine-Mendez, the Executive Vice President at Atlas Bank in Panama City. Panama uses the US dollar. Can you explain how that happened and how well it works?
It works very well. And we use the US dollar from inception, meaning that we prefer to call this economic phenomena, we name it currency substitution instead of dollarization, because dollarization could be full or partial. So our currency substitution happened in 1904 when our country was born. We became independent of Colombia. And that's when the building of the Panama Canal also began simultaneously. And by constitution, we have had the US dollar as legal tender currency. So it's not informal, it is not partial, it's the currency, the official legal currency of Panama is the US dollar. We carry an equivalent currency called the Balboa, but the Balboa is exactly equivalent to the dollar and has always been. And we only use coins, Balboa coins, but the official currency is the US dollar.
It means you can't have a central bank. How do commercial banks deal with that?
It would reduce your transaction cost of your trading partners that have the same currency. So it's important for Scotland to ask, who are our major trading partners? Is it US? Is it Britain? Is it England? Is it Europe? And then you start looking at more precise options. Then because you have lower transaction costs, your prices are more stable. There's more credibility from the investors outside. So investment goes up and it produces growth. It will reduce country risk, so it will lower your interest rates. But above all, it promotes fiscal and monetary policy discipline.
Does it make things difficult for people trying to get a loan or trying to start a business, for instance?
People get paid in dollars. People buy things in dollars. Deposit and loans in the banking systems are made in US dollars. So the whole country, the economy functions based in US dollars. It's a completely full dollarized economy.
Should Scotland be open to the idea of using this system?
I think definitely yes. And Bridget Pan it sounds like a good first option to look at. But don't forget that you need to evaluate who you do business with, who you do trade with. Look for a partner, a commercial partner that you do trade with.
Ariel, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Scotland Tonight. Now, with less than 4 weeks to go, both sides of the referendum campaign will be doing all they can to convince voters their argument deserves support on September the 18th. The Scottish Parliament met today for the last time before polling day, and at First Minister's questions, it was oil which dominated the exchanges between the First Minister and Scottish Labour leader Joan Lamont.
Sir Ian Wood said that he felt obliged to intervene in this debate because he was frustrated at being misrepresented and misquoted. And that is an example, a hallmark of a First Minister's approach to persuading people to support his lifelong political project. Say whatever has to be said to get by the moment, but ignore the substance of the argument.
This poor, benighted country of Scotland with only 16.5 billion of oil up to 2050, worth £1 trillion in wholesale value over that period. Or perhaps, if we go on longer, only 1.5 trillion, 1,000 billion. This poor, benighted country visited with the great curse of 15 billion barrels of oil. Every other country in the world would give their eye teeth for such a substantial resource.
Well, joining me now from Edinburgh is the political commentator David Torrance, and here in the studio is columnist for The Observer, Kevin McKenna. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Last FMQs before the referendum we saw they are dominated by the fallout from Sir Ian Wood's comments about oil reserves. How much of a problem is this for the Yes campaign, Kevin?
I think there's a danger of this becoming an obsession and disproportionate in importance to the campaign. I mean, after all, Scotland's GDP, if you strip oil out, is just about 99% of the rest of the UK. And even just a few months ago, we had the global credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's saying that, again, even without oil, Scotland would be granted one of the top credit ratings. And as Alex Salmond had said there, you know, we still have an awful lot of oil. You know, whether is it a great deal of oil, a massive amount of oil, gargantuan oil. I think an awful lot of countries would love to be in Scotland's position.
David, were these comments taken out proportion, do you think?
I think Sir Ian Wood obviously knows his stuff on oil, and he raised some legitimate points. But in the pure context of FMQs, and I was in the gallery earlier today, I think Alex Salmond did pretty well, because equally oil, energy and the politics of oil is something the First Minister knows very well, and it's very difficult to land a genuine blow on him on that point. I mean, in the wider context, the claim and counterclaim on oil is so great that I think most voters will not really know what to make of what went on today. I think most people acknowledge the oil is there, it's useful either way. OK,
we talked about sterlingization earlier in the programme, the prospect of that in an independent Scotland. The Adam Smith Institute believes that should be plan A for Alex Salmond, but he is wedded to the idea of a currency union, isn't he, Kevin?
Again, I think the whole question of currency is in danger of being seen as something like the affectation of the affluent. Scotland has almost 1 million poor people. 200,000 of those are children, and this isn't something about currency. It isn't playing in their doorsteps. They would rather have any currency or have something at the end of the week that they could call their own. Again, I think that Alex Salmond may have to look at a plan B. He hasn't already, but it's not crucial. It's absolutely not crucial. When he comes to the next two debates, he will have an issue with how he actually addresses that, but I don't think of itself it's absolutely crucial.
We'll talk about that debate shortly. But David, your response to this sterlingization, you know, if Scotland becomes independent, if a currency union is blocked, is sterlingization a likely prospect? I
really don't think it is, and I'm in agreement there, or rather in agreement with me is the Scottish Government's own Fiscal Commission, and they argued very strongly against it. Sure, Panama works fine. I was there earlier this year. Panama City is a very affluent place. Montenegro functions just fine by using the euro. But the crucial point is that neither country has any control over monetary policy, and they're at the mercy of what happens in Washington or in Frankfurt. It is not an ideal situation.
OK. Now, earlier in the week, the Scottish Government sought to switch the focus to health, saying only independence can save the NHS in Scotland from privatisation. The opposition accused the Yes campaign of scaremongering, Kevin, didn't they?
Well, I suppose they would know all about what scaremongering is. Yeah, claim and counterclaim as usual. The Scottish Government is saying that because of the alarming and distressing cuts in the budget for the NHS south of the border, and also the privatisation of the juiciest parts of the NHS, that inevitably, if this pattern is maintained over the next several years, and Scotland is part of the UK, then it will have a deleterious effect on the NHS in Scotland, even though it is a devolved matter.
David, the Yes campaign clearly want to make this a major issue. Will it continue to play? Will it win votes?
They'll continue to push it, and there is, I think, modest evidence that it is having an effect. Is it a good argument? Absolutely not. It doesn't stand up to any scrutiny. The Scottish Government has made great virtue over the past 7 years of having protected the NHS because it is devolved, and there is a strong argument there. They cannot then make a rather spurious leap to arguing that only independence will protect it. Sure, okay. there may be spending impact, but it's up to them. The only people that can privatise the Scottish NHS is the Scottish Government.
OK, Kevin, we're coming back to the debate. Alex Salmond needs a strong performance, doesn't he? Because the last debate, STV 2 weeks ago, most commentators seem to think that Alistair Darling won.
Well, I think most commentators were wrong. I called it at least a draw. I think that Alistair Darling was deemed to have won simply because we were talking from a very low base of expectation with Alistair Darling. I don't think it was Alex Salmond's finest hour. But nor do I think it was Alistair Darling's finest hour. I think it's all to play for in the next two debates.
David, all to play for in the next debate?
Well, Yes Scotland, and I saw somebody from the campaign the other day, they're certainly extremely confident that Alex Salmond will turn in a much better performance than he did last time, and he has to. And of course it comes just 2 days before postal ballots are cast, which could account for more than a fifth of the total number cast. So this coming debate on Monday could be hugely important. OK,
David Torrance, Kevin McKenna, thank you both very much indeed for joining us on Scotland Tonight. Now, the latest news and sport from your part of Scotland.